In October 1962, as the world stood on the brink of nuclear war, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk described the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union with a single, unforgettable line: "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fella just blinked." At that moment, Soviet missiles were being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The United States had responded with a naval blockade and a warning: remove the missiles or face the possibility of war. Both sides had nuclear weapons. Both wanted to avoid catastrophe, but neither wanted to back down. That week, the world came dangerously close to disaster, not because either side wanted war, but because each side was trying to force the other to yield first. This wasn't just diplomacy, it wasn't just posturing. It was a textbook example of one of the most dangerous strategic dilemmas in international relations: the game of chicken. So in this video, we're going to explore the logic of the game of chicken, what it is, how it works, and why it helps us understand some of the most perilous moments in global politics. Chicken is a classic model in game theory, and is used to represent situations where two players are heading towards a collision, figuratively or literally, and each must decide whether to stand firm or to back down. The analogy comes from a dangerous game where two drivers race towards each other. If one swerves and the other doesn't, the one who swerves is labeled the chicken, they lose face. If neither swerves, they crash, and if both swerve, no one gets hurt, but both may lose status. In short, the game of chicken holds that neither player wants to back down, but they really don't want to crash. Now, let's map this onto a payoff matrix. We'll use the simple rankings to represent each player's preferences. Higher numbers mean better outcomes. Each player has a choice between two basic strategies: the straight strategy, meaning they stand firm, or the swerve strategy, meaning they back down. If both swerve, they avoid disaster. It's not a win, but no one loses, so let's call this 3-3. If A goes straight but B swerves, A wins. A gets 4 and B gets 2. If A swerves but B goes straight, B wins and B gets 4 and A gets 2. And if they both go straight, it's the worst case scenario, they crash. Let's call that 1-1. Unlike in the prisoner's dilemma, there's no dominant strategy in this game. Your best move depends entirely on what you think the other player will do. If you believe they'll swerve, your best move is to go straight, but if you think they're going to go straight, your best move is to swerve to avoid the crash. This leads to two Nash equilibria, one where player A goes straight and player B swerves, and the other where player B goes straight and player A swerves. Now, a Nash equilibrium is by definition a stable outcome because no player can do better off by unilaterally changing their strategy. If we're at the outcome where A goes straight and B swerves, neither has reason to switch. A is already winning, and if B switches from swerve to straight, they'll cause a crash, a much worse outcome for both of them. However, and this is the critical distinction, while the outcomes are technically stable, the game itself is incredibly volatile and dangerous. The real tension isn't at the equilibrium, it's at the high-stakes struggle to get there. Neither player wants to be the chicken. Both want to achieve their preferred outcome where they're the ones going straight. This creates a pre-choice phase of intense pressure, bluffing, and threats, the eyeball-to-eyeball brinksmanship, where each player tries to force the other to commit to swerving first. That's the source of instability. This volatile, pre-choice struggle, where each player tries to posture, threaten, and force the other's hand, is really what sets the game of chicken apart from the prisoner's dilemma. There is no dominant strategy. In the prisoner's dilemma, no matter what the other player does, defecting always gives you a better, or at least not a worse, outcome. But in chicken, the best move depends entirely on what you think the other side will do. If you expect them to swerve, your best bet is to go straight. If you think they'll go straight, your best move is to swerve. This creates a dangerous dynamic. Instead of trying to compete, players try to outstare, outbluff, and outthreaten each other. In other words, the game of chicken is a game of brinksmanship. In international relations, we understand brinksmanship as the art of pushing a conflict to the edge of disaster in hopes that you'll get the other side to blink first. You don't want war, but you want the other side to believe you're willing to risk it. The risk, in other words, isn't just in what you do, it's in convincing the other player that you won't back down. Perhaps nowhere is the game of chicken more vividly demonstrated than in the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. In October 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. President Kennedy responded by imposing a naval quarantine around the island and demanding that the Soviets withdraw the missiles. The world watched as Soviet ships sailed towards the blockade, bringing the two superpowers eyeball to eyeball with nuclear war hanging in the balance. But let's map this onto the game of chicken. In this context, going straight means escalating, refusing to back down, continuing the missile deployments or the blockade. Swerving means de-escalating, making concessions and stepping back from the brink. If both sides had gone straight, escalated fully, the result could have been nuclear war. That's the 1-1 outcome, mutual destruction. But if one side blinks while the other stays firm, the firm side gains an upper hand. And remember that neither side wanted war, but each needed to appear to be willing to risk it to convince the other they wouldn't be the one to swerve. That's brinksmanship in action. Kennedy and Khrushchev both had to carefully manage their credibility, not just with each other, but with their own military advisors, their political allies, and even their respective publics. Eventually, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. secretly agreed to withdraw missiles from Turkey. Catastrophe was narrowly averted, but the logic of the game still applied. Both sides tried to win by appearing to be more willing to go over the edge. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis shows us, in the game of chicken, as in global politics more broadly, outcomes aren't just about raw power, they're about perception, resolve, and the calculated risk of signaling that you won't blink. That's why credibility and reputation matter so much in this game. In international relations, it's not just enough to make threats or demands. What matters is whether the other side believes you'll follow through. That's often described as credible signaling, actions or statements that convince your opponent that you're serious. But signaling isn't always enough on its own. Sometimes states or leaders go a step further and use commitment devices to signal resolve or enhance credibility. A commitment device is any self-imposed action that intentionally limits a state's future options to make its threats, promises, or red lines more believable. A commitment device works by reducing your own flexibility, making it harder or more costly to back down later. That self-imposed constraint makes a threat more credible. And historically, we've seen a variety of commitment devices in international relations. During the Cold War, the United States maintained large military forces forward deployed to bases in South Korea, West Germany, and elsewhere. By placing troops in harm's way, the United States raised the cost of inaction. An attack would trigger casualties, making retaliation politically inevitable. Modern tripwire forces perform similar functions but in a more symbolic way. For example, NATO maintains small tripwire forces in the Baltics. While not large enough to stop a Russian invasion, they all but guarantee a broader NATO response if attacked. These forces, in other words, tie the hands of the alliance, ensuring escalation. Public threats and red lines can also be used as commitment devices, as once the threat is made public, audience costs rise and domestic and international actors expect follow-through. Commitment devices work by raising the cost of backing down, reducing strategic flexibility, and thereby making threats or promises more credible. In chicken-like scenarios, these devices can shape how the game plays out, sometimes helping avoid conflict, sometimes making it more likely. They raise the stakes, but they make the threats more credible. But this raises another question. How can we tell the difference between a signal and a bluff? That's the problem in many real-world crises. A signal is a costly or risky action that shows commitment. A bluff is cheap talk, an attempt to look tough without taking on any real risk. The danger, of course, is misreading one as the other. A signal might involve moving troops, mobilizing forces, or issuing a public threat, actions that are hard to walk back. A bluff, by contrast, is just talk. It's cheap and easy to issue and equally easy to ignore. And this brings us to one more concept, the escalation ladder. In games like Chicken, players often increase the pressure step by step, each hoping the other will give in before it's too late. This process is what we call an escalation ladder, involving a gradual buildup of threats, force, and rhetoric, with each step making it harder to step back. That's why the game of Chicken is such a volatile and high-stakes game in global politics. Sometimes the side that wins is simply the one that's more willing or more believed to be willing to risk disaster. So when we talk about credibility and reputation in IR, we're really talking about managing risk through signaling, commitment, and escalation. And in the game of Chicken, that management can be the difference between backing down and breaking down. While the Cuban Missile Crisis is the classic case, the game is constantly being played. We see its logic in the tense military maneuvers between the US and China in the Taiwan Strait, in the nuclear standoffs between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and in the naval confrontations between the US and Iran in the Persian Gulf. In each case, two powers are eyeball to eyeball, each hoping that the other will blink first. These examples, and many, many more, remind us that the logic of the game of chicken isn't confined to Cold War history. It's a recurring pattern in global politics, especially where power, pride, and red lines collide. When leaders face off and neither wants to back down, the question isn't just who has the bigger arsenal, it's more often who's more willing to push the situation to the edge, and whether the other side believes them.